Today is the third day of the fighting in Israel. Intense fighting continues in many places, especially in southern Israel, near the Gaza, near the city of Gaza, the city which, of course, lies outside Israel, outside Israeli-controlled territory, and which has for many years now been governed essentially by Hamas. And in the south of Israel, beyond Israel's border fence, beyond the elaborate fortifications and guard posts and walls that Israel created to try to control access both from Gaza to Israel and presumably in the opposite direction as well. Beyond those places, beyond this line of control which the Hamas fighters were able to penetrate, fighting continues to take place in many Israeli communities, towns, small towns, villages and settlements. And at the same time, there are missile attacks taking place. Hamas is launching missiles at Syria. Israel's air defense system, its so-called Iron Dome system, is in operation. Some missiles, some Hamas missiles, however, do seem to be getting through. I've seen reports of industrial buildings and power stations in places like Ashkelon within Israel, being on fire. I've seen more reports of more fighting in all sorts of places. And as I said, it's clear that the Iron Dome, much talked about and discussed over many years, like every air defense system ever created, it can shoot down perhaps most of the missiles, but it can't shoot down all of them, and some of them get through. And Hamas apparently does have somewhere in Gaza production lines to build these missiles, and they can be built in significant quantities, and Hamas is able to launch them and cause serious damage, or at least some damage, to Israel as well. And I find it extremely difficult to try to work out exactly what is going on. And the contrast with the Ukrainian conflict, which I've been talking about now for a year and a half, more than that, is in some ways striking, because the problem with the Ukrainian conflict is that information is usually in short supply. It comes dribbling from the battlefronts. You have to read what the defense ministries in Moscow and Kiev are each saying. You have to try and work out who are the reliable reporters and track carefully what they have to say. And nonetheless, in spite of all of that, it's still very difficult most of the time to get an accurate picture of what exactly is taking place in the conflict zone, because both sides control information and the amount of information is limited. Well, in this conflict, this current conflict that's taking place in Israel at the moment, the problem is the diametric opposite. There is a huge amount of information pouring out. It's very difficult to process or to get on top of all of it. And it's very, very difficult to say exactly where the front lines are, or whether, in fact, there are front lines, who's advancing, who's retreating, how much damage has actually been done, or any of these things, not because there isn't information about these matters, but because there is a huge information overload, and it is very difficult to decide what is actual, real reporting of actual events and what is simply rumour. Anyway, nonetheless, and despite all of that, I think a number of conclusions can be reached. Clearly, Hamas launched a very sophisticated assault on southern Israel, and some of it was carried out by fighters penetrating the fence, during Israel's long Yom Kippur holiday. At least one Israeli army base was overrun. Apparently all this happened in the early morning. Most of the soldiers at the time on the base were asleep. The precautions, the alerts, the sentries, the various surveillance systems, which one would presume would be functioning in a base like this, either didn't work properly, or perhaps the discipline at the base had slackened. Anyway, it seems that the Hamas fighters were able to overrun this base without meeting much resistance. And they were able to overrun many other outposts that the Israeli military had established along the contact line, and they were able to penetrate deeply into some Israeli communities and towns in the south of Israel. And at the same time as all that was happening, it's also clear, or at least it seems likely, maybe it's not so clear, but it seems likely, that other Hamas fighters were able to penetrate into Israel by sea, through boats. Again, Israeli surveillance seems to have slipped. Perhaps again the Yom Kippur holiday played a role, and they were able to penetrate some distance into Israel in that kind of a way. And my overall impression is that the total number of Hamas fighters engaged in this operation is probably relatively small, numbered perhaps in the few thousands. Talk about an offensive, which I've seen in some places, of an advance by Hamas towards Tel Aviv. Talk about Hamas seeking to advance across Israel and to split Israel in two. Talk about an existential threat to the entire existence of Israel. All of that seems to me exaggerated. I don't think that is the crisis that Israel is facing at the moment. And I don't believe that this is Hamas's plan. I don't think that Hamas is seriously intending to take territory or to capture positions within Israel or to hold on to those positions if they do capture them for any great length of time. I think this was a massive, extremely well planned hit and run assault that is using those expressions is in no way to detract from the skill with which it was and flair with which it has been carried out, or the tenacity of the Hamas fighters, but rather, as I said, a hit and run attack, a kind of giant raid deep into Israel to humiliate the Israeli military and intelligence services, to capture hostages, prisoners, as the Hamas people would say, and Hamas spokesmen are admitting that they now have under their control several hundred. I've seen figures of 150 and 200 spoken about, and to take them back to Gaza and perhaps to use them for leverage in future negotiations with the Israeli authorities. And at the same time, I think this raid was intended to do something further. I think it was intended to consolidate Hamas's position as the leading resistance force within the Palestinian community, and also to harden opposition within that community to what Palestinians consider to be Israeli occupation. So I think in all of this, up to this point, by the way, Hamas has been largely successful. Now, it could also be that Hamas had a deeper objective a further objective, which is to lure the Israeli army into Gaza City itself. And if that is part of the plan, then that part of the plan also is working. Because Israeli officials, Israeli spokesmen, Israeli government ministers are all now talking as if a political decision has been made for the Israeli army to move into Gaza, to try to occupy the town in order to smoke out Hamas there. And of course, the Israeli Air Force has been busy operating over Gaza. It's been carrying out airstrikes on positions in Gaza, and no doubt we will see a mounting escalation of that over the next few days and perhaps weeks. Now, in my program yesterday, I expressed my own deep doubts about the wisdom for Israel of doing anything of that nature. I said that the risk Israel ran was becoming bogged down over days, weeks, months even, in a protracted insurgent war in a densely populated Arab city, with civilians being killed, with all the usual abuses that one expects to see in that kind of fighting. I made comparisons with the Battle of Algiers that took place during the Algerian War of Independence against the French in the 1950s. I could very easily and well see that happening in Gaza as well. I've expressed concern that doing such a thing might radicalize opinion across the Palestinian community. It might radicalize opinion right across the Arab world. But nonetheless, it does seem to be that at the moment is Israel's objective. If any Israeli leaders have considered the possibility that that might be exactly what Hamas wants them to do, well, they've decided to disregard that warning. Now, that warning voice, perhaps, that's deep inside them. Now, in saying all of that, of course, I want to reiterate again that if the Israeli army does enter Gaza, I don't know what the response will be. I don't know whether Israel has a plan for such an operation. Up to this point, I haven't seen much sign that Israel is really working towards any sort of plan. I will discuss in a moment the problems that the Israeli intelligence system and the Israeli military appear to be experiencing. But anyway, it could be that the Israelis have a plan. It could be that in Gaza itself there might be a sentiment that Hamas has overstayed its welcome, that it might be that Hamas doesn't have quite the support in Gaza that it imagines. I have to say, nothing that I have seen or heard in recent weeks or months or years would lead me to any of these conclusions. And yesterday, in discussing the dangers of a protracted fight in Gaza, of Israel getting bogged down in a fight for Gaza, well, I was speaking entirely on the basis of my own beliefs about the situation there. But since then, I've heard various people, I've read various people, I've been reading comments from various people who are much more familiar, in fact, who are very familiar with the geography of this area, both the physical geography, the layout of Gaza, the jumble of buildings that is there, and also the human geography, the landscape, the human landscape the sentiments of the people in Gaza. And they all seem to have exactly the same concerns as the ones that I expressed in my program yesterday. Now, can I say, perhaps the most influential, the most interesting of these, Alistair Crook, Glenn Deason and I have done a program with him. We discussed many topics. We're not just discussed in it the situation in the Middle East, but we obviously did discuss the situation in the Middle East extensively. He discussed from his very deep and wide experience of this region, many aspects of this conflict, what led to the conflict taking place, this outbreak of the fighting taking place now, and he too, and others like him, also believe that Gaza is a place where a prolonged, a protracted urban insurgency could operate, and if that does happen, then Israel's military, which is constructed around reservists, and which has come to rely very heavily, or so it seems to me, on heavy equipment, well, on the face of it, it doesn't look particularly well suited to it. Anyway, we'll see what happens, and we'll see what the Israelis do. But for the moment, anyway, they do seem to be edging towards that kind of action. And I would add that there's lots of pictures now of the Israeli war machine, the Israeli army, gradually cranking up. We see pictures of, there's lots of film now of convoys of tanks and armored vehicles being assembled and moved towards the contact line, moved towards Gaza, even as fighting in southern Israel continues. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the state of the Israeli intelligence system, about the intelligence failure. I said in my program yesterday that my earlier comment the day before that there'd been a massive intelligence failure is in fact a commonplace. Many people have spoken about it. But perhaps it's fair to say that I suspect when the proper research is done, that it will become clear that there was very extensive forewarning that something big was coming. And in fact, it seems as if many people could see that some big event was on the way. And most probably what happened was that there were people in the intelligence system, both in Israel and perhaps even in the United States, who were warning that some big event would come, but that nobody was paying, nobody in the Israeli government, or perhaps even more in the US government, was paying any attention. Now, I saw today an interesting editorial in The Guardian, which discusses conflict in Israel, and it, by the way, tends to take a position that is somewhat negative towards Israel, just saying. But it says that the biggest failure, and this is The Guardian, is not of intelligence and security, but of politics. Less than a year ago, the UN Middle East envoy told the Security Council that matters were reaching boiling point, and there is a link, and it's there takes us to the UN website, and we discover that the person who was giving that warning was the UN Special Coordinator Tor Venesland, and the exact words he used: after decades of persistent violence, illegal settlement expansion, dormant negotiations and deepening occupation, the conflict is again reaching a boiling point, and the UN website has those last words highlighted. And the surge in violence in the occupied Palestinian territory is taking place in the context of a stalled peace process, an entrenched occupation, and amidst mounting economic and institutional challenges facing the Palestinian Authority. Once again, we are reminded that the mix of militant activity, debilitating closures, absence of legitimate Palestinian government, and hopelessness create an ever-present risk of escalation. And those last words by Mr. Vennesland, which he made last year, specifically refer to what he spoke of as the fragile calm in Gaza. And he says, in effect, that the situation in Gaza was deteriorating and that there was a real prospect or possibility that it might once again spiral out of control. So that was Mr. Vennesland talking last year about a deteriorating situation. And then The Guardian goes on to say, last year was the bloodiest on record in Israel and the West Bank and Jerusalem since the Second Intifada ended in 2005. So there's already been a big spike in violence. A third has been widely predicted. This is again The Guardian. Israel Defense Forces raids have soared. This summer saw the largest on the West Bank in 2 decades. And then there's a great deal about what led up to this conflict, which I'm not going to discuss at this point. I'm going to come back in a little moment to some of that shortly. But anyway, clearly, despite Jake Sullivan's, as it is now clear, fatuous comment on the 29th of September, that the situation in the Middle East has never been more calm. Well, despite all of that, the reality is that over the last year and perhaps longer, there has been a steady deterioration in the security situation in the Palestinian territories, including in Gaza, and no one apparently was paying much attention. And of course, going beyond that, it looks as if the Israeli authorities lost track of what Hamas itself was doing, wasn't aware of this build-up or all of these preparations. But I suspect, again, when we finally do get a picture of the kind of intelligence information that was being provided to the Israeli government by their agencies, I personally strongly expect that we will find that there were many intelligence officers, many agents who have been trying to alert Jerusalem, the government in Israel, that there were problems accumulating, that something was coming, and that it was very difficult, in fact, for them to gain attention because the Netanyahu government has been at grips with a political crisis in Israel, in which some sections of the army have also participated, and that has meant that the people who mattered in Israel were not giving this problem the necessary amount of attention. And I suspect that the same was equally true in the United States. I suspect that there were people in Washington, in the National Security Council, which is of course headed by Jake Sullivan, in the White House, whose focus has been so much on Ukraine and on the conflict there, that they just haven't followed what was taking place in Israel itself and what was coming there. Now, I say all of that. I am well aware of the fact that there are some people, there's in fact quite a lot of people, who continue to believe that there wasn't actually an intelligence failure at all, that this was all prearranged, that some governments in the West were, shall we say, not unhappy to see this happen. There's been suggestions that this is this affair has now provided an easy off-ramp for the United States, that it's able now to disengage from Ukraine because the focus is now on Israel, and what happens in Ukraine now will gain less attention, that this crisis could simplify some of President Biden's electoral problems next year, or alternatively, that there was a deeper, more sinister plan to create a crisis in Israel, to try to either change the government there or to reinforce the government there, or to carry out some greater war, perhaps against Iran, perhaps in Gaza, perhaps to complete the process of consolidating control over the Palestinian territories. I know not what. But anyway, I know there's been a lot of speculation about this. All I would say is that these are large, big claims. I think that they would require much more evidence that something like this really did happen before I, for one, was prepared to accept them. Anyway, that I think accounts for the intelligence failure. He put a failure at the top, probably, as I said, all kinds of people trying to pass on warnings, but finding it very difficult to get. Jake Sullivan focused on Ukraine, President Biden also focused on Ukraine and on his re-election, Prime Minister Netanyahu facing legal problems and electoral and political challenges in Israel. All of these people finding it very difficult to pay much attention to these matters. And Israeli generals, also many of them opponents of Prime Minister Netanyahu, senior officers in the Israeli military, lining up on each side of the political divide in Israel, also perhaps not looking at this problem, not heeding the information as they should have done. That's, anyway, my own view. That's, I think, for the moment, a satisfactory explanation of what happened, and it's the one I'm going to stick with until and unless information comes which causes me to change my mind. Now, what about the state of the Israeli army? And a lot of people are making claims that these events have somehow destroyed the legend of Israeli military invincibility. There's all sorts of claims being made about the deterioration of the Israeli army, that the military in Israel is not what it once was. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I think that that is true, and I think that this is a commonplace, and it is in fact something I have been hearing now for many years, that the Israeli military of the 1950s and 1960s was an exceptional force. It was often led by men who had fought in the Second World War. Some of them, in fact, a significant number of whom had actually fought in the Red Army and had even been officers in the Red Army. And of course, it was imbued very much with the fervour that one might expect of a new country, a young country that had just been established. And of course, the young soldiers who staffed that army were very much of that period. Many of them had risen through the kibbutz system. And They too were hard and dedicated and committed to Israel. And of course, in addition to all of this, the Israeli military of that period had massive organizational and technological advantages over Ukraine. Those of them who had experience working in the Red Army, in other European armies, much more familiar with modern mechanized war than the military leaders of the Arab states that they were pitted against. And they understood war. They understood how to fight. They had the flair and the ability to conduct battles, to organize blitzkrieg moves and do those kind of things. And that was true very much in the 50s and 60s. At that time, it's fair to say that in any armed confrontation between Israel and the Arabs that was on anything even remotely approximating to equal terms, or even one where the Israelis were heavily outnumbered, unless the Arabs were in a position of overwhelming superiority and force, the Israelis were always going to win. And their air force was far better organized and far better equipped than those of the Arab states, and the pilots were trained to a completely different level. So that was the situation where Israel won its extraordinary run of victories in 1956, in the fighting in 1956, in 1967, the Six-Day War, which, by the way, I, again, just have very vague memories of, but I can remember people talking about it afterwards, about the dramatic, even spectacular nature of Israel's victory at that time against, well, all the big Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and how the Israelis were able to knock out and defeat all of these Arab states in short order. Anyway, what has happened since is, of course, things have gradually changed. The men who led Israel's army in the 50s and 60s, well, they retired or passed away. The soldiers, the officers who replaced them, are basically products of a much more bureaucratized system. The Israeli army, which had been very light-footed before, it had certainly had some modern tanks and vehicles and things of this kind, but it became ever more heavily mechanized and weighed down with expensive equipment, which made it, shall we say, more heavy but less nimble. And the whole structure gradually became more bureaucratic. And of course, the dramatic victories of the 50s and 60s created a mood of complacency. And I have to say that as early as the incursion into Lebanon in 1982, 9 years after Israel's last big clear-cut victory in the 1973 war, I can remember already that there were commentaries in the media, in the Western media, especially the American media, commenting about the fact that Israel's army appeared to have lost its flair, that it had become weighed down and bureaucratic, that it was no longer the exciting force that it had once been. And no doubt that process has continued, and the political complacency that has been very much a feature of Israeli politics and Israeli society in connection with what many people in Israel probably assumed after the peace treaty with Egypt meant that Israel's position had become completely secure. Well, that complacency and that process of bureaucratization, no doubt in turn has created, if you like, a condition of atrophy, perhaps even entropy. And it's also clear to me that the reservist system, which served Israel so well in the 50s and 60s, when every young man in Israel and many women were in fact hardened soldiers and could be called up very quickly and brought into the army very fast, has also changed as Israel has become increasingly a Western civilian consumerist society, very different from the one that it was in the decades after it was founded. So yes, I do accept that the Israeli army is not what it once was. It is still immeasurably more powerful than Hamas is, and I think that it will have little difficulty driving Hamas, when it's finally deployed and put into operation, out of those places in Israel which Hamas has penetrated. I suspect its real weaknesses, which have been to some extent exposed by the sluggish nature perhaps of the mobilization system, again a sharp contrast to the speed with which Israel mobilized in 1967 and, as I well remember, in 1973. Anyway, the weaknesses in the Israeli military system will really be exposed if, and it's still an if, there is that protracted urban insurgency war in Gaza. It seems to me that the structure, the organization of the Israeli military today, with its reliance upon reservists, is not really adapted to that kind of war. And I've been reading some very interesting commentaries now, appearing, for example, in Russian military publications, in which they say that the reservist system that Israel has is outdated, and that what Israel needs to do is to develop a full-time professional force alongside its conscript reserve forces, something very similar to what Russia has and is now actively developing. But of course, these same Russian commentators warn that creating a military along those lines is a long, complex, difficult, and a very expensive process, as Russia, of course, has itself discovered. Anyway, I mention all of these things. Now, over the course of today, Glenn Deason and I had the great privilege and honour of interviewing Alistair Crook, who has obviously served the British government in diplomatic capacity in the Middle East, who's very familiar with all of the various actors, Hamas, the Israeli authorities, the Palestinians, all of these places. And of course, he has knowledge of the situation far beyond anything that I have or would ever acquire. And in his opinion, the single factor that has been driving this crisis and probably the overall deterioration of the situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories for some time is and has been domestic internal politics. The shift within Israel, within Israeli politics, towards a tougher position, a more focused position on trying to achieve, or rather to complete as many Israelis would say, the project of Israel within the land of Israel, with all that implies in terms of Israeli control of what are still as of this time the Palestinian territories, and the re-establishment in Jerusalem of the temple. The temple, first built by Solomon, destroyed at the time of the Babylonian conquest, rebuilt during the time of the Persian kings, Cyrus and Darius, with the permission of the Persian authorities, who allowed the Jewish people to return, destroyed the second temple, destroyed once again, and this time conclusively, by the Romans at the conclusion of the Jewish revolt, following the defeat of the Jewish revolt and the fall of Jerusalem in 79 AD, 79 years after the presumed year of the birth of Jesus Christ. Attempts were made to revive the temple about 70 years later, 60, 70 years later, in the mid of the 2nd century, the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt against the Roman Empire, at that time headed by Emperor Hadrian, but that revolt was unsuccessful. The temple has not existed since then, but apparently there is an increasing movement within Israel to restore it and to re-establish it in its old precincts, in what is known in the Arab world as the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, as it is sometimes also called, the place where the temple used to be. And of course, that would involve the destruction, as Muslims would say, the desecration of Muslim places of worship, the destruction, in other words, of the third most important religious center in Islam. And this has been ongoing for some time. The incursion into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is located in the Haram al-Sharif, apparently, which I discussed in my previous 2 programs, and which took place last week, is apparently connected with this movement. And anyway, all I will say is that if this is indeed what this present crisis is about, and if there are indeed moves underway in Israel to restore the temple in that kind of a way, then the implications of that are awesome. They would imply events, terrible events, involving both the Jewish people, the larger Islamic community, the world as a whole. And I, for one, am not going to discuss those events or the effects of such actions in this program, because, to be frank, they are beyond my own imagination. Anyway, I would strongly recommend that you go to the Duran, look out for this program with Alistair Crook that Glenn Deason and I have just had, and listen carefully, very carefully, to what he had to say. Anyway, there are other things going on which are connected to this crisis, and one of the most alarming things is that even as the fighting in Israel and on the Palestinian territories is continuing, even as we're looking at the very real prospect now in fact, I'd say the certainty now, of an Israeli military advance into Gaza and an attempt to occupy Gaza and to root out Hamas there with all the dangers which I've discussed. Even as all that is going on, there is now a loud drumbeat that in the West, especially I've noticed in the United States and in Britain, that behind Hamas stands Iran, that Iran supposedly instigated this whole thing. There's apparently an interview with some person within Hamas, or who's claimed to be within Hamas, in which he actually says as much, though I understand this has been contradicted by other Hamas spokesmen, and of course Iran itself is denying all involvement. Anyway, there's been a drumbeat of demands that the United States, Britain, Israel finally have that reckoning with Iran, that the neocons in the United States and their fellow travellers in Britain have been yearning for at least the last 25 or so years. And we've seen large-scale deployments of American warships now. Aircraft carrier and carrier task force is being deployed to the region. F-35 fighter jets are also apparently being deployed to the region. None of this necessarily means an attack on Iran, but the demand to do that is certainly there. Now, I'm going to say straight away that, in my opinion, that would be a disastrous move. An attack on Iran would expand the conflict at a time when every effort should instead be made to try to contain it. One would be looking instead not to attack Iran at this time, but try to contact Iran to see whether the Iranians are able to use their good offices, their influence on groups like Hezbollah, to prevent fighting in southern Lebanon or northern Israel. There's been some talk, a lot of talk yesterday, and apparently missile launches, as I discussed in my program yesterday, by Hezbollah in support of Hamas's offensive into northern Israel. Anyway, trying to persuade the Iranians to speak to Hezbollah to exercise restraint, and perhaps to use what influence Iran has on Hamas. And I doubt personally that it is anywhere near as great as some people think. Anyway, to try to get the Iranians to weigh in, to try to actually bring some restraint to this war so that it can be contained, and the greater risks of an uncontrolled expansion of the conflict across the Middle East are avoided. Instead, unsurprisingly, some people are advocating that the conflict actually be expanded through some sort of strike at Iran. And there's been articles to this effect in the Wall Street Journal and, of course, in the Daily Telegraph here in Britain. Our old friend Con Coughlin is back. He's also already talking about the fact that it's now necessary to strike at Iran. And as I said, at a time when Israel is already, by the admission of Benjamin Netanyahu, its own prime minister, in a potential long war against Hamas, expanding that war to include a conflict against what is arguably the most militarily powerful state in the Muslim Middle East, seems to me to be so misguided as to border upon the irrational. And yet, that is what some people want to do. And of course, all I will say about that is that, of course, if there is a strike on Iran, it will almost certainly provoke a counterstrike. Those who expect, and neocons always sell their plans by telling us that all sorts of wonderful things will happen if their advice is followed, that the enemy is much weaker than he appears, all those things, always turns out to be wrong. Anyway, anybody who expects that Iran will collapse under the weight of the first blow is, I think, wrong, and I fear catastrophically wrong. I think much more likely Iran will unite and consolidate, that the government in Iran will become stronger, but that pressure from within Iran to retaliate will increase. And that would result in an expansion of the war, and Iran, far from becoming, in that case, a force of restraint, far from seeking to restrain Hezbollah in the way that I suggested it might be persuaded to do, or even restrain Hamas, perhaps even trying to broker the release of some of these hostages that Hamas has captured. Well, far from Iran exercising that kind of influence, it will do the opposite. It will probably encourage its allies in Hezbollah and perhaps in Hamas to escalate even further. I'm incredulous, astonished that these kind of demands are being made. But as I've said many times, neocons have no reverse gear. In fact, we see how every bump in the road, on the contrary, induces them to push the pedal on the accelerator even faster. And that's concerning as well. But anyway, I would add that in a program that we've just done on the Duran, that's Alex Christoforou and I also mentioned that I expected that before long we would see that someone in the West, as well as blame Iran for all these problems. Of course, it's nothing to do with the internal situation in Israel or the Palestinian territories, nothing to do with the kind of organization that Hamas is or the belief systems of its leaders. It's nothing to do with the political crisis in Israel. It's all part of some deeply laid plot in Tehran, though, as I said, what the objective of this plot would be, what benefit Iran accrues from having this war at this time, nobody that I have read really explains. But put all that aside, I said that before very long, as well as blame Iran, there would be someone somewhere in the West who would also fasten the blame on that person who is always in the West blamed by the neocons for absolutely everything, that person, of course, being none other than President Putin of Russia. And in fact, I was completely right, even as I was making that program. Well, what do I find? An article by our old friend Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph. The Russia-Iran axis is fermenting war in the Middle East. So already you see someone who is blaming Moscow in some way for what has just happened in the Middle East. Now, can I just say straight away that this is not just based on no information, no evidence at all. And if you go through the article, Richard Kemp provides no evidence whatsoever that the Russians had any role in starting this crisis in Israel. But of course, the reality is that the diametric opposite is true. The Russians are deeply concerned by this crisis. Foreign Minister Lavrov has said that it is urgent that the fighting cease, and apparently the Russians, to the extent that they can, through their embassy in Tel Aviv and their diplomatic contacts with Hamas, and they do have some, though they're not very extensive, are trying, apparently, to calm the situation, though it ought to be said clearly that in this conflict, the Russians are not so much a secondary actor, they're even lower down the hierarchy than that. They are playing a very minor role indeed. The United States, Israel, obviously do not listen to what the Russians say, or not to any great extent, and to the extent that any other external actors have any role in this, they're the two powerful Muslim states in the region, Saudi Arabia and eventually Iran, and of course Iran. But anyway, there we go. So President Putin, much to his surprise, I expect, not that I suppose he gets surprised by very much anymore, but anyway, President Putin is being dragged into this affair, even as his focus remains firmly on Ukraine. And to be absolutely clear, this is the conflict that the Russians are still overwhelmingly focused upon. And it is to the conflict in Ukraine now that I will briefly turn. Now, long ago, 100 years ago, Vladimir Lenin, another Russian leader, once said, or is reputed to have said, I'm not sure when and in what context and where he's supposed to have said it, but anyway, he's supposed to have said that everything is connected. And of course, to some extent, that is true. It is, I think, undoubtedly the case that the conflict that we're seeing unfold in the Middle East is partly related to a growing perception in the Middle East of American weakness, which has been intensified by the war in Ukraine and by the fact that it's widely known across the Middle East that the American military arsenal has become dangerously depleted because of the over-investment in Ukraine. Now, when I said that yesterday, I said that that seemed to me part of Hamas's motivation. Again, going back to that program that Glenn Deason and I have had with Alistair Crook, I noticed that he too said that America, the perception of America growing weaker, is playing a role in this blow-up in the Middle East. But, interestingly, he discussed it from a rather different perspective than mine. I'm not saying that our two perspectives exclude each other. On the contrary, I would argue that they complement each other. But anyway, he too thinks that the story of American decline, which around the world has been intensified by the Ukrainian war and by the defeat of Ukraine's offensive, that is playing a role in the current conflict. As to what Alistair Crook's thinking about this is, well, I'm going to leave you a little tantalised. I'm going to suggest that you go and watch that programme when it comes out. But anyway, suffice to say that it is connected in the sense that from a Russian point of view, there is one benefit to this war, not this fighting in the Middle East, not a benefit that the Russians would induce the Russians to start a war in the Middle East. On the contrary, it is for them a very alarming prospect indeed that there should be a wider conflict in the Middle East. People consistently overlook the extent to which Russia joins the Middle East, how events in the Middle East can affect Russia itself, how Russia's intervention in Syria was partly for that very reason, and why, in light of Russia's proximity to the Middle East, so different from that of the Western powers, so different from that of the United States, for example, the primary Russian interest in the Middle East is to achieve stability and peace there. But anyway, putting all that aside, it is nonetheless the case that the Russians do gain some degree of short-term benefit from this crisis in the Middle East. Because obviously, Ukraine, from having been the dominant, most important story, foreign policy story in the West up to this point, now is likely, especially if this conflict in the Middle East continues and becomes protracted, anyway, that will now lose its prominence. The Ukraine conflict will lose its prominence. President Biden, as I discussed yesterday, and his advisors have been talking about putting together a $100 billion aid package for Ukraine, trying to get Congress to agree to that, to help Ukraine get through until the elections and the inauguration of the new president in January 2025. I have to say that with the fighting that's going on in Israel, with Israel likely making more demands for more shells, for more long-range missiles, for more surface-to-air missiles, for more money from the United States, for more support from the United States altogether, the United States is going to find that with all of these systems in the United States itself, in increasingly short supply, it is going to have to make a choice between providing unlimited supplies to Ukraine or refocusing in supplying Israel. And given that Israel is the United States' oldest ally, strongest ally in the Middle East, given the emotional hold Israel has over many people in the United States, extending far beyond the Jewish community in the United States, to be frank, I don't think Ukraine has any chance of competing with Israel when it comes to getting support from the United States at this time. So that's already a big problem for Ukraine. And of course, if some reports, and they're very minor up to this point, they're not confirmed, but if some reports that some of the weapons that Hamas used in the fighting were originally sourced from Ukraine, that some Western weapons or weapons supplied by the West to Ukraine reached Hamas and have been used by Hamas in this attack, well, that's not going to gain Ukraine any sympathy in Congress at all. Though I have to say that for the moment, I don't place heavy value on these reports. They've not been confirmed, as far as I can see, to any real degree. Anyway, so from a Russian point of view, that does mean that whatever the greater risks of a conflict in the Middle East, things might become easier for them, somewhat easier for them, in their fight in Ukraine. Well, I don't think this should be overstated, because there's been more information now coming in from the battlefronts, and it's now clear that what I was saying yesterday about the Russians having gained the initiative on all the battlefronts is now securely true. In Verbovoye, in Rabotino, in the Vremevka salient area, in and around Bakhmut, and especially in the north, the initiative has passed conclusively to the Russians. Now, there's been especially heavy fighting in the north. I gather there that the Russian army has resumed its advance. It's advancing at the rate of several kilometers, apparently, in various places. There's now once more reports of very heavy fighting in some of the villages close to Kupiansk. It seems there's around 15,000 Ukrainian troops defending Kupiansk. So this is a strong defensive position that the Ukrainians have there. But of course, they're fighting with the Oskol River at their back and with the bridges destroyed and with the Russian Air Force active and with their air defense system shattered, and it might not be possible to sustain a defense in this area for very long. And it looks as if the Russians are in the process of reactivating other parts of the front line also. So there's been more reports, for example, of Russian advances in the area of Vuhledar. The Russians have been gradually increasing the pressure near Vuhledar and in Avdiivka and in Marinka as well. And I've been seeing some maps of the Marinka area, and it does seem finally that over the last couple of weeks, but more so perhaps over the last few days, the Russians are making finally serious progress in Marinka and all of these places. And in the key battlefront, the one that was the place where the Ukrainians were going to break through to Tokmak and Melitopol and to the Sea of Azov in the Zaporozhye front, south of Orekhov. Well, even there, it seems that the Russians are now pushing the Ukrainians back, away from Verbovoye, away from Rabotino. The Ukrainian forces look altogether exhausted and in no condition to continue their offensive, despite all the brave words that have been said. And Ukraine's intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, hardliner that he is, he's given a most interesting interview in which he has finally publicly admitted that Ukraine made 3 attempts to carry out attacks to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. By the way, when that first attack took place, I found the attack so bizarre, so extraordinary, that I didn't believe that it had happened. I thought that the Russians had invented it as a propaganda, for the purposes of their own propaganda, and about that I was completely wrong. Anyway, Kirill Budanov has now spoken about how this attempt to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, of which he was clearly the orchestrator, how that all ended badly. All 3 of these attempts failed and failed catastrophically. And I can't help but think that one of the reasons why Budanov has just given this interview is because he's preparing people for the fact that there will not be further attempts to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and perhaps that ideas of trying to cross the Dnieper and to seize the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region from the Russians and achieve a breakthrough there, that has also been abandoned. Apparently the weather is now distinctly autumnal. I've seen pictures of the ground becoming muddy and soft. There's apparently constant rain. Doesn't look to me as if this is remotely the situation where an offensive like that is going to be carried out. So, given that the situation is turning decisively in the Russians' favour, given that we've seen report after report in the Western media about the difficult situation that Ukraine is in, given that Western media reports have admitted that the West has reached the bottom of the barrel in terms of ammunition and supplies it can send to Ukraine. Why do the Russians need a war in the Middle East? A war that might have extremely negative consequences for them, given that on the battlefronts things are going their way, that their forces in the rear are being built up. If you add all the numbers together, you come up with a military not far short of 1 million men under arms in Russia, preparing to advance against Ukraine. And you also getting reports now, and undoubtedly there are satellite pictures that show this, large trains moving from North Korea into Russia, very heavy railway traffic of a like that we haven't seen for many years, basically since the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course the speculation is filled across the internet and amongst Western governments and in the Western media that these North Korean trains or Russian trains from North Korea are heading west from North Korea into Russia, laden with ammunition. There's some claims that up to 10 million shells have been provided for the Russian military to conduct its offensive in Ukraine. I don't know whether that is true, but those reports are out there. And I noticed a rather odd thing happened today, something which perhaps is another straw in the wind. Over the course of his daily press briefing, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was asked a question. He said he was told that the former Russian politician, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, some years ago, back in 2019, said that in 2023 there would be a crisis in the Middle East, and that the following year, 2024, the Ukrainian crisis would end in some form with Russia victorious. And with a crisis underway in the Middle East, Peskov was asked, well, what do you think of that prophecy of Zhirinovsky's? And Peskov responded, well, Zhirinovsky said all sorts of things, and in fact, I'll give Peskov's exact words. You know that Vladimir Wolfowitz, that's to say Zhirinovsky, by the way, was Jewish on his father's side, made lots of statements which undoubtedly contained an absolutely precise analysis of how individual events and processes in world affairs would unfold in the future. And in fact, going back to the question Peskov was asked, he was asked, apparently what Zhirinovsky actually said was that by 2024, everybody would simply forget all about Ukraine. That's a curious response from Peskov. It's even more curious that TASS, Russia's official news agency, is giving this whole question and answer about predictions from an intelligent and highly educated but very erratic personality, which is what Zhirinovsky was. All this attention. And I wonder whether the question was planted and whether Peskov's answer was prepared in advance and whether TASS wasn't told to highlight it, because it would suggest that the Russians are now thinking that the conflict might actually end in 2024. And for the record, TASS's headline is that Kremlin still mum on potential end date for Russia's ongoing special military operation. And note that Peskov doesn't actually discuss the end date of Russia's special military operation, nor did the question. It said that Zhirinovsky didn't talk about the end date of the operation. He said that people would forget about Ukraine. Well, it does look as if perhaps this is a gentle way by the Kremlin of telling us that perhaps 2024 might be the date in which, the year in which, things will start to happen in Ukraine that will bring the crisis there to some sort of endpoint. Well, that's, of course, the Russian side. For Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East must be extremely concerning. They fear that everybody might indeed forget about Ukraine as the focus shifts back to the Middle East. Must be very true. Their worry about what the Russians are preparing must be growing. And the fact that their military now looks like it's exhausted and run down. They're probably most concerned at the moment about the possible operational crisis along the Oskol River and in Kupiansk. But of course they must be worried most of all about whether or not they will continue to get the support from the West that they're now so completely dependent upon. But suffice to say that whatever the concerns in Ukraine are, I still don't think there is any prospect of negotiations. And I see no sign that any kind of negotiations are really being seriously considered in the West, in the United States. And I've come to the conclusion that the Ukrainian leadership, the political structures in Ukraine itself, render that impossible. So, one way or the other, we're looking at events of enormous, consequential, epochal significance. If all of this, these events in the Middle East, are somehow connected with an attempt to re-establish the it would be the third temple, the temple in Jerusalem. Well, all I can say is that that would be an event that people will still be writing about 1,000 years from now, if that is indeed what is planned and what happens. That, of course, assumes that there's anybody going to be left to write that history. Because, well, as I said, I don't feel able to even imagine events of that scale and significance. But anyway, this is where I finish today's story. We will see what happens, I think this advance into Gaza is now a foregone conclusion. We will see what happens with the hostages. We will see whether the war expands across the Middle East. We will see whether there is an attack on Iran. I think that is such a reckless thing that I think even this administration would balk at doing something like that. But then, I may be wrong. And in the meantime, it seems that in Ukraine, with the failure of the offensive, the outcome, I doubt that it was ever in any real doubt, but it seems to me that we're now heading towards the final end decided by the Russians. But the extraordinary events in the Middle East might have brought that moment closer. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X, the former Twitter. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this program, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me tomorrow. Have a very good day in these momentous times, and see you again then.